And it's part 3 of my 3-part lecture on intelligence. To refresh your memory where we were, this is the big outline for intelligence. Toward the bottom of that outline, the general topic was the effect of heredity versus the environment on intelligence. At a previous lecture, I'd lectured on evidence from identical twins, suggesting that heredity matters. And then, most recent lecture, I talked about the Flynn effect, the fact that IQ scores have risen substantially from, say, 1900 to 2000. Said some things about the Flynn effect, and I said I was going to follow up with a video, and so I am. As is the case with most of the videos that I show in class, you can assume that there'll be 1 or 2 questions dealing with it on our next multiple choice quiz. If you can handle the 2 questions that I pose here, you should be able to handle my quiz questions okay. Name of the video is Why Are IQ Scores Rising? 2 questions that I want you to have in mind as we watch the video. Question 1. The Flynn effect refers to the fact that IQ scores have risen about blank points per decade during the 20th century. How many points have IQ scores risen per decade during the 20th century? 1 point per decade, 20 points per decade, or what? That is question 1. And question 2. What types of intelligence tests have been most strongly affected by the Flynn effect? It turns out it's not just any kind of intelligence test that has shown this increase in scores. It's a specific type of intelligence test. What is that? We will see that question addressed in the video we're about to see. The video we're about to see is not long. It's about 6 minutes long. I wanted to give you the full name for the video so that if you want to watch it on your own time, you can do so. It is available at YouTube. It is not a TED Talk, as so many of my videos are. Full name of the video is Why Are IQ Scores Rising? Industrialization Rewired Our Minds. The video is delivered by a researcher named David Epstein. We will see him in the video. And the video is part of a series of videos called Big Think. I may have shown other Big Think videos earlier this semester. I'll give you a second to jot down that name of the video. You don't need to look it up and watch it on your own unless you want to. I am about to show it here now, and after I show the video, we'll talk about the answers to the questions just to make sure that everybody is on the same page with respect to those questions. Let's center our video so that everybody can see it clearly. And let's actually make it a little bit smaller than that because there's going to be closed captions. And I want everybody to see those closed captions. Okay, that looks pretty good. Why are IQ scores rising? It's about 6 minutes long. We'll watch the video and then we'll talk about the answers to the questions.
effect is this kind of startling finding that IQ scores on IQ tests around the world are, in the 20th century, have been rising at a pretty steady rate of about 3 points per decade. And not only have they been rising at 3 points per decade, but the scores are rising on the most abstract tests and the most abstract parts of tests. So for example, the test that has the fastest rise in scores is called Raven's progressive matrices. This has nothing to do with anything you've learned in school. It's just patterns, abstract patterns in a sequence, and one is missing, and you have to figure out how to fill in the missing patterns. It's pure abstraction. This test was created so that you wouldn't have to bring anything to it that you've learned in life. If Martians landed on Earth, this was supposed to be the test that could determine how clever they were. And yet, it's the place where we've seen the fastest rise in scores, in this abstract thinking skills that aren't really specifically taught anywhere. When James Flynn, the professor who first noticed this trend, for whom the Flynn effect is named, started wondering what was going on, he went back to some famous studies by a Soviet psychologist named Alexander Luria. And Luria found an incredible natural experiment. In the 1930s, when the Soviet Union was nationalizing essentially some of the remote territories, villages that had not been developed for agriculture, and they wanted to develop industry in those places, Luria wondered if taking people who were living in what he called a pre-modern sort of environment, where they were subsistence farmers, and quickly moving them into modern work where they had to work together and coordinate schedules and coordinate tasks for agriculture, even have some schooling in some cases, how would that change the way that they think? And so he saw this natural experiment where he came in the middle of this revolution, where some of these pre-modern villagers, again using his terminology, were still in their original environment as subsistence farmers, and others were getting connected to the modern world, getting a little bit of school. Some were being trained to be teachers, others were being appointed to head collective farms and had to start managing people and thinking ahead and setting long-term sort of complicated goals. And what he found was that this actually had a profound effect on the very way that they think. When the pre-modern villagers were given skeins of wool or silk of different colors and hues and asked to organize them into groups, they basically said, it can't be done, none of them are similar. Whereas when some of the villagers who had been touched by modernity were given this same task, they pretty easily grouped them into colors, even if they didn't really have names for those colors. They started to recognize the abstraction of a color for use in grouping. And the same thing was true with shapes. So, for example, a 26-year-old remote villager named Alieva was asked to group certain shapes together, but to her, a square with a solid line was obviously a map, and the same square with a dotted line was obviously a watch. She could only see them as these concrete objects, whereas the villagers who had started to interact with the modern world were used to abstract classifications. And even if they didn't know the names of the shapes, they recognized that the concept was the same and they could group them together. And so that's just sort of one example. But in all of these tests, what Luria noticed was that the pre-modern villagers were grounded in the concrete, in their own direct experience. They could only answer questions based on concrete objects that they had directly experienced, where the greater the dose of modernity that villagers had had, the more they had to engage in complex interconnected work, the more they were able to group things with abstract concepts, to use classification schemes, or what James Flynn came to call scientific spectacles. He'd say they see the world through scientific spectacles. Some of the ways that modern work changed the very thinking of pre-modern villagers are sort of miraculous. On the screen is a famous example called the Ebbinghaus illusion. And if you're watching this, then you're clearly engaged in modern work and in the modern world. And I want you to tell me which one of the central circles looks larger. And again, since you're engaged in modern work, the circle on the right probably looks larger, the big one surrounded by smaller circles. But pre-modern villagers actually saw correctly that both central circles are actually the same exact size. And scientists who studied this think that this has to do with how we differently perceive these circles in relation to one another. So, For the pre-modern villagers, they see each individual circle. They're not as drawn to the holistic context, and so they can accurately see the size of the central circles. Whereas people who are more used to abstraction and thinking of things in classification and in relation to one another are more drawn to the holistic context. So the contrast between the circles affects your perception. Now, we, in our modern work world, have to use abstraction constantly. We have to apply our knowledge to situations that we've never actually seen before. And we get by on that. It's called transfer. We have to take knowledge from one place and use the concepts and apply them to something we've never seen before. And there's evidence that the act of doing that has continued to make us better and better at this sort of abstract thinking that shows up on the Raven's progressive matrices. So modernity has essentially changed the way we think to make us better at using broad abstract concepts and applying them to situations that are unfamiliar to us. And it's not to say that one type of thinking is better than the other. That's certainly not the case. They're just adapted to different conditions. So whereas the pre-modern villagers kind of would, to use familiar terms, often miss the forest for the trees. They don't see the holistic concept of these groupings, whereas we in the industrialized world will often miss the trees for the forest. We see these broader concepts, but sometimes not the individual concrete details that they do.
Okay, in watching that video, I was kind of alarmed that the audio bar on my recording software was not moving when the guy's lips were moving. So maybe my capture software captured the audio on that video, maybe it did not. Fortunately, I played the version of the video that had closed captioning, so you will be able to at least see the words if you did not hear them. And just to be double sure that everybody's in good shape, I'm going to talk about the answers to our questions. Question number one had been, the Flynn effect refers to the fact that IQ scores have risen about how many points per decade during the 20th century? The answer to our question. Flynn effect refers to the fact that IQ scores have risen about 3 points per decade during the 20th century. That is a big rise. Supposedly, if we are able to climb into a time machine, transport ourselves back to 1925, the average person amongst us would emerge as being particularly brilliant compared to the average person in 1925, 1930. Now, question number two kind of gets to the core of what the Flynn effect is all about. Question number two had been, what types of intelligence tests have been most strongly affected by the Flynn effect? And our answer to question two, what types of tests have been most strongly affected by the Flynn effect? Tests that assess abstract reasoning skills. Tests that assess abstract reasoning skills. Not tests that deal with vocabulary, not tests that deal with your ability to read a verbal document and summarize what the main points from that document were. The most abstract kinds of reasoning skills. I'm going to show you an example of one item that gets at these abstract reasoning skills. You won't be tested on this specific item, but I wanted to communicate what I mean by abstract reasoning skills. This is actually a screen capture that I got from the video that you just watched. He talked about an assessment test, an intelligence test called Raven's Progressive Matrices. Raven's Progressive Matrices. This is an example of an intelligence test that assesses abstract reasoning skills, and the item looks like this. This is a matrix, consists of 3 rows running like such and 3 columns running up and down. Don't pay attention to what's on the right side here. These are your potential answers. The idea is look at the rows that make up this matrix. notice what kind of progression is taking place. Abstract from that what's happening in these matrices, and then choose the icon on the right hand side that illustrates what the next item in the sequence should be. For example, the top row here illustrates squares. Notice how the image changes as we go from this square to this square to this square. The next row provides circles divided into quarters. Notice how things progress from this circle to this circle to this circle. And the last row is your question row. It's diamonds. This diamond, this diamond. I am pretty sure that the correct answer to this particular item is B. The reason being, notice how things change as you go from square to square. It's in the upper left-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, and then the lower right-hand corner. The black square appears to be moving in clockwise fashion. When you look at the row with circles, you see the same thing going on. This quadrant is black, then it moves to this location and then this location. So if we were to switch and look at the diamond instead, the black square begins here and then it moves here. So what would the next most logical diamond be? Probably this diamond, one where the black square has moved to the right side. That's an example of an item from Raven's progressive matrices. Deals with very abstract reasoning skills. The explanation that's offered is the fact that in 2020 we live in a world where you have to be able to deal with abstract concepts and icons. Think of navigating the most recent app you downloaded on your cell phone. You wouldn't be able to use that app if you had to rely totally on verbal written instructions. You have to be able to look at icons and images and abstract how you're supposed to use that app. That is the kind of reasoning skills that we have developed to a higher and higher degree during the 20th century, and that supposedly is one of the reasons that IQ scores have risen. Our environment has changed, and it has demanded that certain mental abilities improve. This Flynn effect is sometimes used as evidence that, yeah, the environment matters. Even though heredity may have an effect on intelligence, the environment has an equally powerful effect. Now, that is my lecture on intelligence and the end of this video. And look for email from me, and I'll talk about what happens after this video, if anything. If you don't see any more videos posted, that means it's the last of the lecturing that I'll be doing for our current unit, but just keep your eye on your email.